Isidore Francisco was born in 1892 to his father, Paul Francisco, and his mother, Octavia Bottom Francisco, in Evergreen, Louisiana. Isidore Francisco is my great-grandfather. My name is Kenneth Bowman. Today we're going to be talking about the family history of the Francisco family. Let's get started. Paul Francisco lived until he was in his 90s, and his mother, Octavia Francisco, lived until she was 103 years old. Isidore's grandparents on his father's side were Jewel and Josephine Francisco. Jewel lived to be 110 years old. His grandmother on his mother's side was Madame Gustave. She lived to be about 70 years old. Isidore's parents and grandparents grew up in Louisiana. And I know it doesn't matter much in today's time, but they were all dark Creoles, except for Madame Gustave. She was light French. Isidore's parents had 10 children. A boy and a girl passed away in infancy. So Isidore grew up with 7 siblings. Isidore's parents, grandparents, and all of his siblings all spoke French. They obviously went to school to learn English, but the primary language that they would speak at home was French. When Isidore was about 2 or 3 years old, his parents, Paul and Octavia, moved the family from Evergreen to Mansoura. Mansoura, Louisiana is also the place where Octavia was born. Around 1908, when Isidore was about 15 years old, the family moved from Mansoura, Louisiana to Boley, Oklahoma. The family enjoyed speaking French while doing farm work. Isidore was assigned to maintain the family garden with his mother. When Isidore and his siblings were not working, they would go to school where they were taught English. Isidore left school in his late teens with about a 3rd grade education to focus more on the Francisco family farm business. One day, Isidore went to church on Sunday at Coon's Corner with a friend to meet a nice girl. He met Gertrude Dyer, a conscientious young Methodist woman who was praying for a husband. In fact, she saw the man she was going to marry in a dream. She didn't tell Isidore until quite some time later that as she and her mother approached the church that day, upon seeing Isidore, she told her mother, "That's the man that God showed me is going to be my husband." On September 12, 1916, Isidore Francisco and Gertrude Dyer were married at the Catholic Church in Boley, Oklahoma. Gertrude was only 19 years old, and Isidore was 24. They knew they wanted a large family, and they promised each other before they were married that they would teach their children the ways of the Lord. And they did. The Isidore Francisco family lived first near Chillsville, then moved to McArbour, where the population was predominantly Indian. They later moved to an area around Castle, Oklahoma. Not long after moving to Castle, Oklahoma, they connected with members of the Church of God. They attended service, received salvation, and were baptized in a place called Deep Fork, Oklahoma. Isidore Francisco and Gertrude Francisco's spiritual life was the foundation of their family. In 1917, their first son was born. By 1924, they had 6 sons. Clement was born in 1917, Otis in 1919, Purvis in 1921, identical twins Emmanuel and Nathaniel Francisco, born in 1922, and Felix, born in 1924. Then 5 girls, Georgia, born in 1926, identical twins Robina and Roberta in 1928, paternal twins Lucille and Lucy May in 1929. Then came 2 boys, Lawrence K. Mackey in 1921, and Charles Choppy, born in 1934. Gertrude's mother, Georgia Dyer, a midwife, helped deliver and care for the Francisco children, along with Allen twins, Irma and Ora, the McGlory girls, and Velma Carter, maiden name Smith. Georgia Dyer was remembered by her family as a strong woman who helped raise Zidor's and Gertrude's 13 children. Raising 13 children is expensive now, and it was expensive then. Zidor and Gertrude were in the agricultural business, but it was time to level up. Zidor connected with Levi Garone, a man from Oklahoma who was living in Brawley, California. Levi told Zidor and 5 other men around Deep Fork about higher paying job opportunities in California. All of the men dropped out except Zidor, who saved money from his first cotton harvest of the year to finance the trip. Zidor and his 3 oldest sons, along with Robert Weldon, the chauffeur, and Tyree Fuller, left for California in a 2-door 1929 Model A Ford car. Zidor's second son, Otis, worked with others to overhaul the car behind the parts house in Bristow, Oklahoma. And they started their trip to California without any serious breakdowns. There was good money in hay, but it was hard work, and if Zidor hauled hay, the boys would not have any supervision. So he picked cotton with the boys instead. Zidor and his boys earned money by picking cotton for a week with the Webster family, who was picking cotton in Yuma, Arizona, where the Dees and the Jesse families lived. Zidor and his 3 oldest boys made their way to Bakersfield, California. Zidor could pick about 450 pounds of cotton, and all 3 boys could pick over 200 pounds daily. They made about 1 cent per pound of cotton near Greenfield, California. Later, they worked for the Anton Giovanni brothers and stayed in their cabin close to Buena Vista School. Eventually, Zidor saved enough money to lease a house and a farm with about 80 acres of land from a Belgian called Phil Neff, who was also known as the Belgian. He shared profits with Phil on a 50-50 basis. Zidor mailed excess fruit, dates, nuts, and other food items to his family in Oklahoma whenever he had excess. With a house and 80 acres to farm, Zidor bought a half-ton 1931 Ford truck. He loaded the 1929 Ford car on the truck, and he and Otis drove back to Oklahoma to move the family to California. It took about a week to finish selling and pack the family up. The Francisco family was leaving their friends, church congregation, community, neighbors, and all of their loved ones. Zidor promised his mother Octavia that he would come back every year to visit. He kept that promise, often several times per year. A few days before Christmas in 1936, the family was heavily overloaded and broken down on their way from Oklahoma to California. When they broke down near Las Cruces, New Mexico, where Alfred and Mabel Moultrie lived, Mr. Moultrie picked the family up and hosted the Francisco family for Christmas festivities. Accompanying the Francisco family on their trip was Zidor's sister, Aunt Arzelia, a cousin, Clarence Bridget, who was also the main driver, A.W. Sherman of Deep Fork, a young man named Ozzie Williams, and Mr. Howard, an older man. The family arrived in Bakersfield, California within the last few days of 1936. The children enrolled in Buena Vista School, and the family lived in the cabin on the 80-acre farm. The family then moved to Gosford Road and went to Old River School and lived in a big white house, which is exactly what Gertrude dreamed about when she was thinking about moving from Oklahoma to California. Things were progressing well, and soon, in January 1937, 2 carloads came from Deep Fork: the J.K. Blackwell family, their daughter, Marietta, and her husband, Everett Piero, Henry Clarity, and Artie Clarity, Garfield Jeter, and wife Luzelle. The Blackwells had bought a 1926 Buick, so that there was no need for Zidor Francisco to go back in his truck to go get them after all. Jeter owned the other car in the group, and on February 20th, 1937, more of the Deep Fork group arrived. James Watt Harris and wife Arlena W.E. Bramlett, Israel Buck Johnson, and Rosie Lee Moland and her 5 children. Her husband, Bill, and Ulysses Norling had come to Arizona first, then had gone on to Bakersfield. Prosperity loomed for everyone. Cultivating by tractor, watering by irrigation, paved roads, and running water and electricity in the home was quite a contrast to Oklahoma. On Zidor's first trip to California, he had looked up the Tomlins who he had known in Oklahoma. Richard Tomlin told him about a man named Mateo Smith who wanted to help the poor, so he was selling tracts of land at very reasonable rates. Mr. Tomlin had already purchased land from Mateo Smith, so it seemed pretty legit. Zidor Francisco bought a couple of plots of land from Mr. Smith for himself, and he also mentioned that he was interested in purchasing additional plots of land to build a church. Well, as a favor, Mr. Smith agreed to very favorable financing terms, and once the financing was in place, Eleanor Tomlin, the wife of Richard Tomlin, contributed the first dollar to the payments. Rebecca Tomlin, the wife of Hayward Tomlin, contributed another dollar. James Harris, Bill Mullen, J.K. Blackwell, A.W. Sherman, and Zidor Francisco were among those who pledged to help make the monthly church payments on the new plots of land. The lots were about $250 to $300 each, so it took some time to pay it off. While living in the country, they held church services in the family homes and in various houses of the various Deep Fork residents that had migrated to Bakersfield, California. An arbor was built where Zidor Francisco lived. Other families came from Deep Fork, Oklahoma. Some of their names are Webster Weldon, Isaiah Weldon, Leonard E. Gaines, Ulysses Norling, H. Thomas, I.C. Chandler, Mac Moland, Jefferson Piero, George Dyer, Isaac L. Dyer, and many, many others. Zidor Francisco was not afraid to take lead in things. He bought some lots on Haley Street and put some small houses there. They also built an arbor for the church on his lots. The other families who bought on Haley Street were the Shermans, the Harrises, and the Norlings. A small church was built on Brown Street. It was torn down and a larger one was built. This was torn down and an army barracks was moved onto the lot. Later, a larger building facing Virginia Avenue was built behind the barracks, and it was used for worship for many, many years. The Zidor Francisco family moved from the country into town to the William Street residence, with several small rentals. Next, they moved to the Brown Street residence right beside the church, where Zidor Francisco had erected several small rental houses and tents for sheltering people. Years later, Zidor Francisco sold this property to the church. As there were lots of adobe buildings, Zidor Francisco learned how to make adobe bricks. And after school, his children helped make them in preparation for building the permanent home at 305 South Owen Street. This adobe, made of mud and straw, served as great insulation, and it was years before they needed an air conditioner. Gertrude Francisco got tired of the dust, so later, the whole building was stuccoed. Zidor Francisco acquired quite a lot of property in this area, including building 2 sets of apartments at the home address. He says he became interested in rentals because he knew people would always need a place to stay. He became interested in farm labor contracting because you can count your money every single day. With lots of children to help and lots of farm workers living in the rentals, he had a head start on farm labor contracting. Zidor Francisco's farm labor business, his rental business, and his church contributions all worked in concert with each other. The farm work in and around Kern County included cotton, potatoes, peas, green beans, onions, sugar beets, alfalfa, and many other crops. During some summers, the children camped in the Selma and Kingsburg areas, with lots of workers from Bakersfield tagging along. They worked in the grape fields, peaches, apricots, and many other types of crops. The family also lived in Satakoy and Oxnard areas, and worked picking walnuts, prunes, and other types of crops that were located in those areas. About everywhere the family went, they had some sort of church in some sort of fashion. At first, the farm workers were hauled around in trucks. but eventually they leveled up and they graduated to buses. George Gallstone, formerly of Radio KGEE, was one of the main drivers of the bus. The Zito Francisco family helped with all types of jobs in the business. They had mechanics, crew bosses, hauling, bookkeeping, a cashier. Zito Francisco would call the cashier a cash eater. When Manuel and one of the twins went to Oklahoma in a truck to claim his bride, Irma Hill, among the people coming back with them was Alvin and Brunette Love and their children, with whom our family became very fast friends. Among the Francisco family's closest friends who didn't come from the Deep Fork area was the L.E. Games family. Of the Francisco family members, the third boy, Purvis, died in his early 20s, and Roberta, a twin of the oldest set of girls, passed away in her late teens. Zito Francisco didn't know the two sets of identical twins apart, according to reports. He often said, "One of you girls," when he was trying to get one of the girls' attention. The boys were called Little Honey and Big Honey, and he referred to them as "one of you honeys" when he wanted to get one of the boys' attention. For any of the other children, his expression would be, when he was trying to get one of their attention, he would say, "One of you chillin'." Like most children, the Francisco children had their pet peeves, but they loved their parents dearly. They didn't always obey, but they respected them. Zito Francisco believed in counseling and not sparing the rod. He would rarely, if ever, whip the girls. He was stronger than the average man, and he said that he thought he really might hurt them. The children thought so too. Zito and Gertrude Francisco taught their children to do the best that they can to love each other, to try to overlook each other's faults and their weaknesses. Choppy, the baby boy, after a critical illness when he was just 2 years old, became seriously ill, and he never recovered. Choppy stayed with the family for as long as possible, but growing up in a neighborhood with an illness was very difficult. When he wasn't staying with the family, he stayed in Porterville State Hospital at an institution that can give him better care. Gertrude Francisco was very economical and made use of every single thing she practically could. She was self-sacrificing. She enjoyed good communication with her children and with her husband. She just loved to talk. Zito Francisco was very easy to get along with. He was comical, he was humorous, and he was just fascinating to listen to. Talking about him was, and is, one of the most delightful pastimes of his children and his children's children. Going to the movies and dancing were not allowed. However, he made sure that his family had wholesome entertainment with adult supervision. Sometimes the family would visit San Diego and go to the zoo. They'd go to the beach. They'd go riding around the ferry. They would even go sightseeing in Tijuana, Mexico. Since his earliest association with the Church of God, Zito Francisco had been active in furthering the gospel. He had been a participator and not a spectator. He was ordained in Los Angeles during his 40s. Traveling extensively throughout California, he also made trips to Arizona, Alabama, Oregon, Ohio, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Old Mexico, unselfishly giving time, talent, money, and influence to the cause. Gertrude Francisco was a minister, and also she often traveled with Zito Francisco on his trips. They were instrumental in helping to establish the Church of God in Stockton, California, where the Breckenridges, the Pieros, the Dillards, the Ivies, the Fullers, and others had settled. Most of the families in the congregation were from Oklahoma. Gertrude Dyer Francisco passed away in Bakersfield in 1958 at the age of 59. Zito Francisco then married Mrs. Maddie Celestine Liggins from Boley, Oklahoma. She had 5 grown children from her previous marriages. Both husbands were deceased. The children, Willie J. Everett and Nettie Mae Celestine and Elizabeth Moore, all lived in Oklahoma, and Wilma Jean Jackson lived in Richmond, California. From this marriage, Papa had 23 step-grandchildren and 5 step-great-grandchildren. Isidore Francisco and Maddie Francisco lived in San Diego from 1964 to 1970. He served on the Bakersfield Church of God Board of Trustees many years before moving to San Diego and after his return from San Diego to Bakersfield. At the time this was documented, he was the oldest minister in the Bakersfield congregation if you look by age and by service. In 1971, he accepted the pastorate in Allensworth, California. Allensworth was the first town in California to be founded, financed, and governed by African Americans. The original town site is designated as Colonel Allensworth State Historical Park. 4 of Isidore Francisco's sons were in the armed services at the same time. All were honorably discharged. For a long time, the Frisco children remained in Bakersfield. The oldest son, Clement, moved to Detroit, Michigan to work in the auto industry. The Francisco family has a long history of service to our country. When Otis helped move the family from Oklahoma in 1936, his plans were to go back and finish high school. He finally moved to Boley, Oklahoma in 1970. He was a trucker and a minister. Daniel lived in Inglewood, California. He was a trucker, and he served on the church board of trustees in Los Angeles. Manuel Francisco lived in Pacoima. He was a trucker. Felix made his home in San Bernardino, California. He worked in a school and he was a minister. Georgia lived in Altadena, California, and she owned a janitorial service. Robina lived in Bakersfield. She served as an account clerk and retired early on disability. She also served as a secretary to the church and the board of trustees. Lucille lived in Bakersfield and worked at a school. Lucy lived in Bakersfield, and she was a homemaker. Mackie lived in Los Angeles and was a minister at a church in Los Angeles, California. And Choppy, he lived in Porterville. Isidore Francisco passed away in February of 1983, and I was born in July of 1982. And I can tell you, his legacy lives on. You don't believe me? Watch the video. Thank you.